Thank you, Millicent, and thank you all for coming. Good evening. Just before we start, how many of you here might have been victims of torture at all? Anybody in the audience? Or how many of you... Ian, no, thank you. And how many of you might have been on the other side in some way, the system that's complicit to it?
Oh, yeah, by definition.
3, and 1 in the panel. So,
in the system.
Well, Ian's book has left me feeling cold and angry, but also a little worried, because it's sort of stuff that I thought I should have known and cared about, and he made me care about it. And it's sort of even more unsettling in a way, because instead of offering us a clear sort of way forward or an opinion, that's sort of sprinkled with stuff to me that says, well, maybe in some occasions torture might work. And I'll discuss that with you a bit, Ian. So we've got Ian, who's going to outline a little bit about the book. We have with us Ruth Blakely, who is an academic who's an expert, research focused on the state violence and state terrorism, is that right? So she's an absolute expert in that. Clive Baldwin, who is with legal advice with Human Rights Watch, and David Davis, who has been on the cutting edge of this, an MP, resigned his seat and won it back again over civil liberties, and has been somewhat, as he put his hand up to, part of the system from time to time. Ian, perhaps if you just give us a sort of 5-minute précis of what you've got in the book.
Yes, certainly. I was thinking about the best way of doing this. Now, I thought, well, because I'm a reporter, and reporters are people who, ask questions and dig out the odd fact and try and weave them into stories, I thought I'd tell you a story which might help explain how it is that I came to be making inquiries about some of the darker aspects of Britain's counter-terrorism efforts since 9/11 and since 7/7. I work for The Guardian, and a few years ago I was asked to go to the Old Bailey to take over our coverage of a trial at the Old Bailey. The reporter who'd been covering this terrorism, it was a terrorism trial, the reporter covering it was leaving the paper. I went along and there were 7 young men on trial, all accused of conspiring to cause explosions. They were all young British Muslims. They're all alleged to be associated with Al-Qaeda. 6 of them had been arrested in the southeast of England, and 1 had been arrested in Pakistan. This was a guy in his early 30s from Luton called Salahuddin Amin. What Salahuddin Amin said was that it wasn't disputed that Salahuddin Amin was held for 10 months in Pakistan before being deported to be put on trial at the Old Bailey. And what he said was that during this time he was repeatedly tortured, and he'd be asked questions about his associates, and then the torture would stop, and the 2 British men calling themselves Matt and Richard would turn up and ask him the same questions over a glass of water, whilst his main torturer was sitting behind them in the same room. Then they'd ask a few more questions, and they'd go away, and then the torture would start again, and the next session of torture would be based on the supplementary questions that had been asked by these 2 British men, Matt and Richard, who were from MI5, they explained. And so he gave this account, and I found myself thinking that I wasn't particularly surprised, because I'd been to Pakistan a few times. I thought I knew that it was likely that somebody would be tortured if they were detained in that country and accused of terrorism offences. And to some extent I found myself thinking, well, if you get caught up in this sort of plot, that's what's going to happen to you. And then I heard a second man give a similar account in an interview with the BBC, a Londoner detained in Pakistan, tortured, he says, asked questions by the British. Then I heard of a third man, a man from Greater Manchester, detained in Pakistan, tortured, he says, flown to Manchester to be put on trial, minus 3 of his fingernails. And then I was asked to make some inquiries about a 4th man, and he was a guy from Birmingham called Rashid Rauf. Rashid Rauf was accused of being a key figure in the airline plot of 2006, the plot to bring down a dozen or so airliners over the Atlantic, the plot that's led to all of these very stringent security measures that we have whenever we pass through an airport anywhere. At the end of 2007, the Pakistani authorities announced that he'd been allowed to go and pray in a mosque on his own and had escaped. So here you had a man who was accused of being a very senior figure in Al-Qaeda's most ambitious plot against the West since 9/11, and we're being told he'd gone to pray in a mosque on his own. And I have to say that nothing in my experience suggests to me that that's at all likely to be true. And I thought it would just be interesting to take the official count and pick it apart a little bit and see what happened. So I went to Islamabad, and on my way there, Benazir Bhutto was killed, and I've spent most of my time reporting on the aftermath of that. But I did get to see Rashid Rauf's lawyer. There's a guy called Hashmat Ali Habib. And I got to see him in his office in Islamabad, and it was very late on, it was New Year's Eve, 2007. And I, there I was working. I sort of wanted to be pretty much anywhere else, really, but I had this job to do. So I got to see him, and about 9 o'clock at night, and I'm sitting in Hashmat Ali Habib's office, and he's this stout little guy. It's this very cluttered office full of law books, this big desk, and he's sitting there, and there's just one light, and just this very dim bulb. And so I said to him, your client, Rashid Rauf, was he tortured? And Hashmat Ali Habib just starts laughing at me. He's just laughing in my face. And what I hadn't realised before then, that torture wasn't just likely in those circumstances. Torture was a given, to the point that Pakistani lawyers don't ask their clients whether they've been tortured. They don't document their injuries. They very rarely complain about it because it's an absolute given. That's how it works. So Hashmat Ali Habib's laughing at me when I asked if his client had been tortured. I said, oh, did anybody other than Pakistani officials question him? And he just looks at the light fitting, and he stares at the light fitting. And he's directing my gaze at this light fitting, and he wants me to know that we're not alone in this conversation. There's other people interested in what I want to ask him and the answers he's going to give. So he stares at the light fitting a long time. And he says, yeah. And I said, well, who? Who was it who questioned him? And he looks at me and he says, I asked, were they British? Were they Americans? Were they British? Were they British? And he just looks at me and says, Gora. Urdu for whites. Were they British? Gora. And I felt at that point like this light bulb had just gone off. It was a real moment of epiphany. I found myself thinking, there's 4 of them. They're all British. They're all alleged jihadists. They're all picked up in Pakistan. They're all tortured. They all say that they were questioned by British people after being tortured. And so there's a pattern there, and a pattern sort of suggests a policy. I thought, is there a policy? Is there really did the last government, the Blair government, really have a secret torture policy? A policy that resulted in people being tortured, in British citizens being tortured? And I thought, well, I've got to find out. I've got to find out. And I did, and the answer's in the book. The answer's in the book.
Which is on for sale there for £15.
But the book isn't just about post-9/11 events. No. I've gone back to, I mean, you can go back as far as you like, really. I started in 1939, 1940, and using documentary evidence, I look at what we did in the Second World War, and using documentary evidence, I look at what we did in the Cold War. And using documentary evidence and interviews, I look at what we did in various colonial conflicts, and again in Ireland. Lots of interviews carried out with former RUC officers who worked at interrogation centres in Belfast and elsewhere. And then onto the post-9/11 world and the post-2003 invasion of Iraq, because there are sort of dots that you can join. You can follow this sort of path, this secret path, and you keep coming across the same techniques, and the same techniques of concealment and obfuscation all the way through. And so that essentially is what the book is about.
Can I just bring Clive in there? Can you define for us what torture actually is? And also, as Ian says, as it goes up from the Second World War on his book, has those laws and definitions changed at all?
Yeah, thank you. And just before doing that, I also want to say that this is, for Ian, is an extraordinary book, and Ian hasn't paid me to say that, but I didn't think, having dealt with several of these issues, parts of them, I didn't think I could be shocked anymore, but Ian's book is both shocking and well written and puts together a very compelling historic narrative. And just the law on torture, it's been there, it's been pretty clear even since the Second World War. Persons were put on trial at Nuremberg and elsewhere for torture. The law has been crystal clear since the Torture Convention of the 1980s. It's a United Nations convention. It was actually the government of Margaret Thatcher that partly drafted it and certainly signed up to it, and came into English law in the Criminal Justice Act of 1988, which I think was probably the first year that David was an MP.
Mm-hmm.
Came through.
That's right, I voted for it.
And that defines torture as essentially serious physical or psychological harm deliberately inflicted on a person for a particular purpose, such as questioning, obtaining evidence or even punishment.
So that includes things like sleep deprivation and making people stand up for a long time, and those, it's not just pulling out fingernails.
It's like, because it can include serious psychological harm. I mean, that can also depend on something putting together. Obviously, blindfolding, probably even not putting a hood over someone's head for half an hour is unlikely to be serious psychological harm, but putting some hood over someone's head for days on end, and certainly combined with other techniques, as the euphemism puts it together, in order to create serious psychological harm, even if nothing physical is done. So that's been quite clear in English law. The interesting question for me, and both reading your book, and I'm currently working on a report for Human Rights Watch on the British abuses in Iraq and what should be done about them, is why, if the law is pretty clear, why does hardly anyone get prosecuted for it, and given the extent that's there? And some of the issues to throw out is partly why isn't it applied overseas? Why is no one prosecuted? It does the continuing involvement of members of the government, such as the Attorney General, as you've pointed out also in the book from decades ago, but still happens, have a negative effect. And even on the worst type of international crimes, the sort of things, we even don't think that Britain usually does war crimes and crimes against humanity. Those are their war crimes. Torture committed during a war or during a military occupation by military forces is a war crime. And torture done as a systematic or widespread manner as a policy is a crime against humanity. And that's when an idea of command responsibility comes in, and those at the top can should be held criminally responsible.
So the examples that Ian has in his book, particularly about the post-Iraq or post-9/11 thing, are crimes against humanity.
There may be. If he's showing that its torture was systematically inflicted as a policy, it would be.
Ruth, we're going to get into a bit more detail in a minute, but are we any better or worse than any of the Western democracies on this issue? Because you've studied all of these countries.
I think what I would say is that when I read Ian's book, what struck me was the very striking parallels between what Britain has done in history and what the US has done much more recently. And in addition to that, what the French have done in history. So, and Ian alludes to this at several points in the book, but both the British and the French have a very highly developed set of practices that they euphemize. They are forms of torture, and they were used widely in their struggles against powers, against states that were trying to resist colonial power, particularly in Algeria, particularly in Kenya, but also Malaya and other places. And when you read Ian's book and you read that historical narrative, particularly about the British case, what's very striking is the learning from those cases and the implementation by the US of practices that are very similar, if not identical. But it's not only about the practices, it's not only the techniques. So when you read his book and you read about the things the British were doing during the Second World War, after the Second World War, in Kenya, in Northern Ireland, in Malaya, you find that the US has also used those practices and shared intelligence on those practices in Latin America during the Cold War, and then much more recently, and they're the cases we know about. But the other learning that has been shared is how you conceal these practices. So when I was reading about the ways that the British tried to hide their use of torture against German prisoners of war, and then after World War II, and then also in Northern Ireland, it's almost identical to the ways that the US has tried to circumvent international law, secure legitimization secretly by top lawyers in the administration, but then promote obfuscation to the public. And it's very, very striking that all these states, particularly the French, the British and the USA, seem to be doing the same things. That's not an accident, I don't think. And actually there's evidence that intelligence agencies, the lawyers, the politicians, do actually talk to each other about these things. And so although Ian's book makes an incredibly important contribution in terms of the British context, when you put that in context of the international situation, you see a pattern of systematic abuses that are shared internationally.
What about these coalitions of the willing that I lost track of in Kuwait and Iraq and whatever, which have 30-odd nations, many of them European nations? Are any of those the good guys in it that say, well, sorry, we're not going to be dealing with this? Is it mainly France, Britain and the US? Or?
Not particularly, if you're not familiar with it. In 2006 and 2007, both the European Parliament and the Council of Europe carried out their own investigations into European complicity in rendition, secret detention, and they found that nearly every European country in the European Union was involved in some way, either providing airports or providing secret prisons or providing passage or airspace for the rendition flights flying over. Most of them knew about it, most of them were involved in hiding it. And there's some quite surprising countries on that list of complicit states. Sweden, for example, who we all assume to be very do-gooding and right on, apparently not. So I think, I mean, there are degrees, and so Poland, Lithuania, and Romania have all actually had secret CIA prisons on their soil. A lot of the other countries were only providing airspace or refueling stops for the aircraft, but they knew what was going on.
David, does torture work?
No, well, sometimes, I think. Can I come back to that? Because I just
Sure.
I want us to tell a story first. I mean, Ian started the story, and the thing that was most shocking for me in Ian's book may sound odd to you, coming from a politician. I was surprised by the level of systematic duplicity that went on over the decades by the British government. Not just in covering up torture, I suppose you'd expect that, but in pretending to have given up torture and then continuing with it. I mean, the Northern Ireland example is a good case. And
Could you just explain that for a second, the Northern...
well, what happened in Northern Ireland? Amnesty complained. I think it was. Remember the sequence right? Ian will correct me. Amnesty complained about the use of the 5 techniques: hooding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, a whole series of techniques, which together were judged to amount to torture. This is back in the early 70s, I guess, and we said basically we'd given it up. And we said publicly, right, we're not going to do this anymore, and then it's quite clear from me in the book that we continued to do it thereafter. So the level of active duplicity at the highest level, really, that went on. Now, this was surprising to me, and so this is why I want to tell you the story. A little while ago, I wanted to do something in Russia. It doesn't matter what, and it's not relevant today anyway. And so I went to see an old friend of mine. Now, this old friend knew a lot about Russia because he was the ex-head of counter-Soviet operations for MI6. So somebody you think would know about Russia. Anyway, I went to see him, and it was at about the time we had just gone through the really big round of public row about the Binyam Mohammed case. You remember all of that? Ian and I were very closely involved in it all. And I went to see him, as you do, with an ex-deputy head of MI6, having a cup of Earl Grey tea in the Athenaeum. And I said, I can tell you his name. I said, really good of you to see me. You know, I know that I'm absolutely not flavour of the month with MI6 at the moment. And he said, oh no, he said, you're absolutely right. He said that we let ourselves down in this. He said, this is self-defeating, it's immoral, it's un-British. Actually, he said un-English, but I think he meant un-British. And he said, you know, and then he went on to say something which turns out to be completely wrong. He said, you know, in the Second World War, we demonstrated the Germans tortured, we didn't, we won. You know. And now this is a very expert, well-informed man. He said, yeah, but we let ourselves down in Cyprus with Aoka. We let ourselves down with the Mau Mau. This was before the Mau Mau story had come out in the public domain, so he knew about that. He said, we let ourselves down in Northern Ireland. We keep doing it. You're right to say. Now the point about the story is 2 things. Firstly, this incredibly well-informed man, absolutely on the inner ring of the secret state, did not know about what happened in the Second World War and thereafter. So we have not just covered it up from the public at large, we have deluded ourselves in terms of what's happened. So Ian's done a great task in that respect, in pulling out into the open something quite shameful, but something we ought to know about. The second thing was he reminded me of something that was said to me when I went through my counter-interrogation training many years ago, and the same sort of techniques were used on us. And we asked, because we were supposedly going to be going up, if we ever worked against the Soviets, you know, well, What's to stop them actually torturing us, pulling our fingernails out and using electrodes on us? And the comment was, well, you know, in the Russian army there will be honourable people who will not put up with such things. You know? And what's been interesting about what the story Ian tells is actually the honourable people were kept out of this, and that people were led to believe that it was in the greater good to do this because, and it's kind of coming back to your question about does it work, because this was the only way to save lives, to save innocent people's lives and so on. Now, one other thing, the great argument that's always put up, everybody I think accepts that in the long term torture is deleterious. It's deleterious because it gives you the wrong answers. The absolute classic case, Sheikh al-Libi, who was punished with waterboarding, I think 80 odd times, until he admitted that Iraq was involved with Al-Qaeda in the development of weapons of mass destruction. A complete lie, of course, but he kept being asked the question until he eventually gave in and said yes. And that was, of course, part of the intelligence which led to the invasion of Iraq and the death of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. So people, I think, now understand.
But just when you were, because you were in the foreign minister at one at one stage, you were shadow home at one stage.
Yeah.
How much of this is new to you?
Nearly all of it. Nearly all of it is post that era, shall we say? I mean, I was foreign minister and absolutely no knowledge of this. I was. As you say, shadow home secretary. It didn't really raise its head as an issue until after that period. Had it done so, then I would have been right inside.
But what was in your mind when you were holding that shadow secretary post? If you had suddenly gone to the other side of the dispatch box, you must have been aware that you would have to make these decisions.
Well, what is apparent is that members of the government, my sort of opposite numbers, the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary of the day, were signing off elements of this. I mean, the thing that will demonstrate this will be the Libyan case. When they get to court, if they're ever allowed to get to court, when the civil cases come, we will see in detail how Britain signed off for opponents of the Gaddafi regime to be rendered by the Americans generally back to...
And you would have stopped that?
Yes, I would have stopped that.
Despite
absolutely.
all the repercussions of the special relationship and all the rest of it?
You cannot see... I mean, the one thing that was sort of slightly undermined my sort of belief in my own view on this slightly was Ian came up with a completely new variant of the ticking bomb scenario. The normal argument that's put up by the would-be torturers, that's a cruel description, but the people who justify torture, is what do you do if this gentleman here is known to have placed a bomb somewhere in London, and I've captured him, and I've got an hour to get out of him where that bomb is. It's a scenario that's replayed time and again in episodes of 24 on the American TV. That's the circumstance in which it might be justifiable to, put a bullet through his kneecap or something. That's the sort of argument that's put. I've never yet come across a real example of a ticking bomb scenario. None of these actually meet the ticking bomb. Ian actually did come up with one, or it's a recurrent one actually, and that is the need to turn somebody. Because the agents that they turned in the Second World War and subsequently had to be turned in a day or two, otherwise it wasn't credible. That's the only time I've seen a ticking bomb argument actually stand up. Whether it's true, I don't know.
I mean, you mentioned a couple of times that I noticed of things when I think post-Dunkirk, you say that Britain's use of torture has been inordinately successful. You mention in Aden when Prendergast went in that once he went in with his fairly ruthless thing, the British began to get an idea of what the enemy looked like. So I just wanted your view on this, because what we heard post 9/11 all the time was torture doesn't work and therefore we don't use it. But what your view, having gone through all this evidence, is?
I'm not too sure how successful it was in Aden. What they were saying in Aden is that we have to continue to torture people because it's the only means we have of discovering the nature of the threat against us. We need to learn more about this insurgency, and torture is all we've got because our local special branch officers have all been killed.
That was what the government was saying.
That's what the British colonial authorities in Aden were saying to the Foreign Office. Don't take this away from us. We have to be able to carry on with this. This is all the only tool we have. In 1940, the first people that that MI5 were torturing at their interrogation centre near Richmond were British, members of the British Union of Fascists. They were convinced that as the German forces were racing across France and the lowlands, that there must be some sort of fifth column working behind the lines. And they thought, well, if there's a fifth column in France and Belgium, there's going to be a fifth column in Britain. So they started trying to root out the fifth column. It didn't exist, but it didn't stop them from torturing a couple of dozen members of the British Union of Fascists, who were then parked in a camp on the Isle of Man, so that they couldn't talk to anybody until the end of the war. And when they did talk to people in 1945, nobody cared because they were fascists and it was 1945. But they then started rounding up those genuine Nazi spies who were being parachuted into the country or brought in on boats. And as David says, what they were doing is they were using torture to as they put it at the time, to secure the transfer of loyalties.
What sort of torture? Give us an example of what they were doing.
Well, we know that what the British Union of Fascists said was happening to them early on, which was that they weren't being physically struck, but they were being kept in dark rooms for days on end, bright rooms for days on end. There was lots of manhandling and threatened executions. But that was something that was happening over a period of weeks, whereas some of the Nazi invasion spies were being turned in hours. The same people who were running this interrogation centre in 1940 then went to run interrogation centres after the war in Germany, 1945 to 1948. And they were killing people. They were actually killing people. The taking of life wasn't unknown at some of these interrogation centres. And they were subject to cold and stress positions. They'd shackle people naked in front of open windows in painful positions and douse them with water in the middle of winter. And starving them, starvation, and beatings.
Well, it sounds to me that from the description that you've given me there is more mild than what I've heard. What you said was happening in Morocco and Pakistan with the fingernails and that just left a...
No, one of the things that... There was an investigation into the goings-on at one British interrogation centre near Hanover by a former Scotland Yard detective who was brought in to investigate, and I obtained his report under the Freedom of Information Act. And one of the things they were doing there is they were using torture implements that had been recovered from a Gestapo prison in Hamburg. They were using what they called shin screws.
Shin clamps, yeah.
And there was physical evidence, there was medical evidence to support this allegation.
Clive, are the techniques getting better or worse, or...?
Some of them are just the same. I mean, what's now called waterboarding.
Yes.
It's been interesting to say the different names which are used, like the New York Times, for a century would call it torture. And it was well known and documented even in the American War in the Philippines 100 years ago. When it became a controversial issue, just about 10 years ago, then it starts becoming waterboarding. They drop the term torture. Sometimes you get redefined. And that's, again, as you were just saying, is partly was the American approach under the Bush administration. Get someone not to claim to do torture, but to redefine it. And I think coming back to the issue of whether it works or not, is rather that torture is probably the only, or certainly the most famous, practice which is banned absolutely in all circumstances and no question. And that's not just human rights organisations who have done that. That's been states and governments, and virtually everyone in the world has agreed to that. Of course, I mean, all governments claim and have the right to kill people in certain circumstances. No one has denied that. They know there's a necessity for that. They've never publicly accepted the necessity for torture. And I think that's because, torture seems to work in breaking people, if that's your aim. So it might work in this circumstance, which also to me was new as well, the idea of breaking someone in order to turn them. It breaks them if you just want any form of information. And it certainly is good if you just want to get a confession to anything. So it has some utility in those circumstances. But it's not a utility in terms of justice and getting correct information.
Ruth, I'm interested is that if everybody has signed up to say that it's illegal, and yet it seems to be completely widespread. It's a little bit like the prohibition on alcohol, isn't it? I mean, everybody seems to be using it. What do you think should be done to try to police it in a way that's more effective?
I think the first thing is to be honest about what most torture is being used for. Most torture has absolutely nothing to do with gathering intelligence. One of the things that's quite striking about Ian's book is he does cover lots of cases where the justification was about securing intelligence and information. But the reality is that an awful lot of that was simple brutality. And if you look at Clive would know this even better than me through his work with Human Rights Watch, most torture regimes are not really about getting intelligence at all. They're about threatening a wider population. They're about intimidating people into silence. They're about deterring people from joining insurgent groups. And there is a lot of people say, oh, well, how can this have an intimidating effect if it's done in secret? Well, it might be done in secret from the perspective of us, the British public, but certainly those people who are subjected to this, the networks that they're from, know full well what's going on. So it's intended to have a fear-inducing impact, and that is what most torture is about. Most isn't about intelligence gathering. So I think one of the first things we have to do when we look at the governance of human rights and ensuring that states are consistent in the obligations that they've signed up to.
But at the moment it seems to be that you have governments signing a public policy that they know they're not going to keep. So that's not working, is it? If torture is... So is there a level of torture that could be allowed, in other words, to stop the... So you could do something, but you couldn't pull the fingernails. Is there something, sort of, are people discussing that, or is it just...
No, because I think, as Clive mentioned, the overwhelming body of opinion is that torture is torture is torture, and there are not lesser forms of torture because these things are never done in isolation. So hooding isn't simply putting a bag on someone's head for half an hour. Hooding occurs in a situation where the individual doesn't know if they're ever going to be released. They don't know if they're going to be killed. They don't know if they're going to be further tortured. They don't know what else is going to happen. So I think even if you say certain techniques are permissible, they still have that psychological impact and therefore are forms of torture. And I think to deal with the question of holding states to account, there are organisations that are working on this and are doing a lot of work to try and expose what states are doing. And I think the Council of Europe investigation, the European Parliament's investigation, the UN investigation into torture in 2009, attempts in Britain as well, work of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, which is tireless in saying to states, you do these things, we want to hold you to account. There are a number of problems with that, of course, because as Ian's book shows in great detail, states will go to extraordinary lengths to try and conceal what they're doing. And then, frankly, it comes down to the work of people like Ian of the Academy, and I'll maybe say a bit more about that later, to investigate these things fully and to get this information into the hands of those people who can pursue these cases through the courts or through international governance mechanisms.
David, I wonder if we could sort of start to join those dots up you were talking about. What in your mind would have happened in, say, the Mau Mau's, Malaya, the War on Terror, if these techniques that we now know were not used? Where would we be with those?
Well, in some cases, they may have been shorter. And one of the things that comes out of Ian's questioning of the ex-torturers is some of them think that actually what they did prolonged the conflicts they're involved in. The second thing I'd say is, it's quite dangerous to say, well, what if we just took out the torture? Very often the people who go in for torture are people who are trying to make up for an incompetent policy. If you want a demonstration of that, you should look at another book, which is a thing called The Black Banners, written by Ali Soufan. I don't know if you're familiar with it. He's the FBI guy who was the lead interrogator in Aden or Yemen, whatever, at the time of the USS Cole incident.
Oh, okay.
The FBI had a completely non-torture approach to interrogation, and it worked. And the CIA, at the time of 9/11, had not interrogated anybody for 25 years. So we have this incompetent, naive organisation suddenly light upon torture as its way to sort out a problem it didn't know how to deal with. So I just make the point that people who are going for torture, to a very large extent, very often, are just not very good at what they're doing. and they're patching up what they're doing. Second thing about it is, a lot of it's about revenge. Ian refers to this in one of his, I think it was the post-war, the German camp, Nendorf. Are you doing this just to get the information, or is it just for purposes of revenge? And acceptance is somehow is about revenge. And it's always very much easier, bluntly, to torture people from another culture than it is from your own, crudely. So for all those reasons, on balance, occasionally we might have lost an advantage. But what's the test of our morality as a civilization? That's when it matters that you actually don't do it. That you say, oh, well, actually this may cost us something, but we are who we are. We stand for certain standards, and that's it. And the terrible thing about Ian's book is that clearly we don't stand for certain standards. What were your last words? What were the last words in the last chapter? Oh, I must read them out. I mean, I really must read them out. Where are they?
The conclusion.
The conclusion, the last sentence of the last chapter. But delve a little deeper, observe a little more clearly, and far from being alien, torture can be seen to be as British as suet pudding and red pillar boxes.
But it's not as bad, Ian, is it? If we go back to the Mau Mau, your description, which was particularly chilling, where you had the torturers or the interrogators or the British was sort of saying these are subhuman people, they're a psychotic race, they need to be eliminated. This was the sort of view that was coming across there. And compare that to your descriptions of what happened in Iraq, where there was more of a watch on it. It is getting better. It's not nice, but a Mau Mau situation could not happen in today's society with the televisions and the parliaments and the human rights watches, or not.
Well, people were dying in British military custody from 2003, between 2003 and 2004. And Baha Musa wasn't the first person to die in British military custody. There were several others who died in British military custody before him. We just don't know a great deal because there hasn't been any inquiry into it. Kenya was particularly savage for the reasons you explained, but the methods used then migrated to Cyprus and then to Aden in the 1960s, and they were allowed to migrate because at every stage they were surrounded by denial and official secrecy and obfuscation. If it is slightly more controlled now, it is probably because there is a slightly more, what happens more in line with a clearly thought out government policy. So in early 2002, every MI5 and MI6 officer in Afghanistan was given instructions about what they should and should not do. And what they did from then on was really quite carefully choreographed. It was directed from London, rather than just allowing the man on the spot, that great British colonial tradition, the man on the spot to make his own decision.
The Mau Mau killings was the man on the spot doing it, or the local...
It was the man on the spot, but there was knowledge by the governor and there was knowledge by the colonial secretary, as he was. They knew exactly what was happening. They did know.
And the Iraq killings, what was that?
I would imagine that Jeff Hume would say that he knew absolutely nothing at all. He claimed, didn't he, that he didn't even see that awful video of Baha Musa and his friends being subjected to stress positions and hooded, etc., etc. A lot of what's happened since 9/11 has been the result of acts of omission. So you're told you cannot be seen to condone torture, but you're under no legal obligation to intervene to prevent it. But you mustn't be seen to condone it, so you're not in the room when it's happening. That doesn't stop you from standing outside the room, passing questions in. But you will not dirty your own hands with it. That's the way it's been happening.
Well, it's more, surely it's more positive than that, Ian. I mean, you talk about it a bit. I mean, I'm just thinking of the Rangjit Ahmed case, where you had, yeah.
But that's a remarkable case, but it's a series of acts of omission, isn't it?
Well, it's a little more than that. I mean, just so people know the case, I mean, this gentleman was a proven terrorist, he's a convicted terrorist. But the evidence to convict him was all gathered in Britain up to a certain point. He then went off to Pakistan, and he was allowed to leave to go to Pakistan after they already had all the evidence to convict him. They let him go to Pakistan. The British agencies notified the Pakistani ISI, and we know, because it's a matter of public record, that they always torture. He was then, it was pointed out to the Pakistanis that he was a person of interest to them, interested in jihad. They were getting given the questions. There were consultations with MI5 and the Manchester Police on the questions. I mean, all the way through, it's more than acts of omission. They positively encouraged this process to happen. And at the end of it, he came back, and of course they couldn't use any of the evidence against him because from Pakistan, because it's all obtained under torture, and he had 3 missing fingernails to prove it. You know?
And they didn't need to use that evidence because
didn't
they'd
need
already
anyway.
gathered the evidence before he left Manchester.
Yeah. So I think it's more than a mission. I think I would count that as more than a mission.
Can I come in on this point?
Of course, yeah.
I mean, I would like to make the argument that it is just as pernicious as what the British were doing in Kenya, you know, in the 60s. And that's because we're living in a globalised world where these practices are not simply about the British state and its involvement. So we might say, well, the British has got more control over this than it had in the colonial period. But actually the British torture regime is plugged into a much bigger regime of torture. And what you have is the US detaining hundreds of thousands of people. In Iraq alone, the US detained all military-aged males in the city of Fallujah. Tens and tens of thousands of men for months and months on end, many of whom were subjected to pretty harsh interrogation and some torture, a lot torture, and then also total deprivation of all of their civil liberties on the basis of what? That they are old enough to hold a gun. Add to that the hundreds of people who've been flown around the world and held in detention sites in third-party states who have much worse records than we do on torture. And in addition to that, the fact that that then legitimises those states in doing those things on a much wider scale locally. One of the things I'm interested in is not just that what the US and the British and the French have done, but how that has then led to the kind of spreading out of these practices much more widely. The fact that now it's much harder for organisations like Human Rights Watch to hold the usual suspect states to account, because they can turn around and say, well, the US and the UK are doing this too. And so I think this is in many respects more pernicious than it was before, because it's globalised and because there's an air of legitimacy given by those states who claim to hold others to account for their human rights records.
Yeah. And when you were asking, well, something like Kenya couldn't happen now, I would say it probably has done and will continue to, because the cycle hasn't been broken. And one of the key aspects to breaking that cycle, and we see it in other countries as well, is making sure those who torture know they will be held accountable in a way, and really held accountable, and that really means being prosecuted for it, and going up to senior levels. And at the current level, in none of these cases that Ian described, has anyone senior being convicted. I think there was only one case, and that goes back to the 40s when some senior people were even prosecuted.
And,
so
and the Mau Mau victory to claim damages last month, has that sort of moved things forward a bit, or? That
may start. I mean, no one's going to be prosecuted for that.
Yes.
I mean, interestingly, one of the most... I was at one of the Mau Mau hearings and talking to one of the lawyers from the 50s there, and he said one of the people he was most scared of at that time was a young officer, and I thought, I know that name. And this person was then, who was British, then went over to be a senior person in Bahrain and a member of this, well, head of the secret police there, and installed a regime of torture there, which was then abolished by the current king, has now been brought back under the current government. So the British torture experience has not just been in Kenya, it's been exported to former colonies and protectorates as well.
I'd like to open up to the audience, but first, if the gentleman that put his hand up there that said, do you mind just telling us very briefly what happened to you?
Yeah, sure. Basically, I'm the son of a former Reprieve client, Reprieve, the legal charity that works to prevent the death penalty and litigate the war on terror. And in the aftermath of my father spending 4 years on death row in Pakistan, it was nothing to do with the war on terror. He was framed for murder. I was arrested as a 17-year-old as emotional blackmail. I spent 6 days in a police station in Pakistan, being threatened with abuse and witnessing abuse or torture rather than use the euphemism for 6 days, which felt more like 6 months. My father's been released. He was acquitted after 4 years. I've then gone on to become a Reprieve Fellow. We work to investigate torture within the police of British nationals for around 18 months. And after that culminated, I then travelled to Pakistan and continued my work.
And so when in your 6 days you saw torture but were not actually tortured, or?
No, I was threatened with it. I think you said to somebody to put your hand up if they were almost about to be tortured. But yeah, I was basically, I witnessed the abuse of children, women, and even the elderly in 6 very, very long days. And the only reason I wasn't tortured was because the police officer who ran that police station, and this is going to sound really weird, but I knew his nephew in England. And so when he realised I was from Birmingham, and then he asked me, "Oh, where in Birmingham? Sparkhill? Do you know Sparkhill?" I said, "Yeah, I live in Sparkhill." And then I realised his surname on the door as I went in, and then I just, burst out and said, "Oh yeah, I know your two relatives, so and so and so and so." And he just literally just turned around and said, "Okay, you'll be okay here, don't worry."
Okay.
So it was a matter of amazing circumstance that I wasn't tortured, and neither was my father, to be honest. And we were the lucky ones. I mean, as you guys have already said, it's endemic there, it's systemic, and as Ian found out himself, it's not really a question of whether you'd be tortured, but it's how much you've been tortured.
Okay, thank you. And there was a couple of hands went up. If one of you gentlemen just like to say why you put your hand up.
So yeah, it was really just a very general point that I think if I vote and partake in this society, in this country, that I'm culpable.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, sorry. I only put my hand up because I personally feel that anybody who's a British citizen, votes, takes part in our democracy is culpable for what our government do. So
Okay.
I'm not personally owning up to torture.
And the gentleman behind you there?
I served in the Royal Marines for just over 10 years, and I served in Afghanistan, so I feel some way involved in the whole thing that's happened recently.
And were you involved in any interrogations or?
No, I wasn't. I had been trained in tactical questioning, but I didn't take part in any of it myself.
This is a familiar scene, though, is it, that you're hearing up here, of the sort of culture that you worked in Afghanistan?
To some extent, yes. However, I didn't partake in it, and I certainly wouldn't condone it. Unfortunately, you do see, you can, and I suppose to some extent you are trained, and it's ingrained in you to see the enemy as the enemy, and to see that all means necessary mean all means necessary. However, how it's defined, I did write down a couple of questions, if I may.
Sure, of course, yep. The floor's yours. Yep.
Certainly to Mr. Davis. As you mentioned, you were subject to resistance to interrogation training. Do you feel you were tortured?
No.
Because the way they've explained the conditions, to some extent, it does define you as being tortured. Secondly, the effective techniques that you mentioned that the FBI were using prior to the USS Cole that were devoid of torture, what were those? I just find, I'm not advocating torture in any way, but I find interrogation devoid of difficult conditions perhaps somewhat useless.
Good,
Yeah, well,
good point. Yep.
Yeah, well, I rather agree. Before we came in here, we were having a drink downstairs, and I said, I take a slightly tougher view on things like hooding and some degree of pressure, should we say, psychological pressure, than perhaps the rest of the panel. But that doesn't mean I approve of torture. So yes, I agree with that, with that comment. What the FBI did, and it's really been the sort of standard procedure, is play to the cultural norms of the people they're dealing with, trying to build some affinity, create a certain degree of uncertainty as well. I can't. I mean, I'm not an expert interrogator, but I can strongly recommend you read some of the work that was done, because they got information out of people which you would not have expected to get out of them, because you've got control of somebody's life 24 hours a day. That alone gives you certain advantages. You determine, when you see them, what time of day you see them, what they know, what information they have. A lot of it's about making them feel you already know half the information. I mean, when one of the classical techniques that is used is somebody's just been arrested. You talk about tactical questioning. Tactical questioning is the modern phrase for battlefield interrogation. They're probably quite shocked at having been brought in already. They're sort of shocked they're out of their own environment. And you say to them, right, okay, now, you had a conversation with Mr. Cobain last Thursday. What was the conversation about? Well, firstly, you told them you've talked to Cobain. So that they're surprised. they don't answer. So you say, well, what you talked to them about placing that bomb, that IED. Now, on Wednesday, you had a conversation. Who was that with and what was that about? They don't tell you. Well, that was with Mr. Davis. And eventually they give in because people feel weak. And so you use other intelligence sources, typically Intercept and other sources, to give the impression you know everything anyway. So that's one of the techniques. But there are lots of techniques like that, all of which are entirely humane. They involve a degree of psychological pressure. They do not involve pulling people's fingernails out, you know. And truthfully, they're more effective. And had the CIA been more forthcoming with the information it had and the subjects it had under control, they may even have prevented 9/11. There's little doubt about that. That's what the 9/11 report effectively shows.
Clive, just before we take it, one more question. This interesting phrase, interrogation devoid of difficult conditions, could you give us a definition of where the difficult conditions would become torture?
That is when it's severe harm inflicted, again, physical or psychological, for a specific purpose.
Can you give us an example? You're sitting in a room, your chair, naked, like, give us an example of when that line is crossed.
It can be crossed fairly easily. I mean, certainly just, we can say that pulling out one fingernail, well, that would immediately be so.
But I'm thinking specifically of this really fine line that you drew over there, I think, when you use this phrase, you know, what is an interrogation devoid of difficult conditions?
It's and it's the second level beneath it, which is also absolutely prohibited, is inhuman and degrading treatment. So you could say, and that's not even defined, but it's that anything which is there to degrade someone, to humiliate them, would be illegal. Anything which is treating them as less than human. I'm trying to think of an example where you would. It's not quite. Usually, when people are prosecuted for torture, it's pretty straightforward. Everyone knew it was torture to begin with. It's not. I don't think in the circumstances I've been dealing with, both monitoring and coming across.
It's not a fine line.
People knew what was right and wrong in it.
Any questions, gentlemen, at the back there? Can you say your name or organisation and all that sort of stuff?
It's Toby Scolthorpe. I'm a journalist. David, when you gave your rather interesting insight into how Britain is really run with your cosy chat in the Athenaeum, you said something very revealing, which is that you couldn't name your MI6 man. Now, obviously, his opposite number in Moscow knows who he is, but you feel you can't tell us. Now, clearly, there's a cult of secrecy that surrounds the intelligence services. Now, I understand that up to a point that is necessary, but how are we going to practically, if we are ever going to prosecute people who are responsible for these things, separate that from legitimate accountability?
Well, the most important thing, I mean, is that you ensure, in particular, that the courts can do just that. The courts can pursue it both in civil courts and criminal courts. And one of the current very topical problems that we have is the government's proposal for secret courts, which will prevent, bluntly, it will effectively prevent people who have been mistreated by the state from taking them to court and claiming damages off them. That's the most important thing. I don't think you need to know the name of the individual officer to expose things that have gone wrong. And the best example I can give you is the Binyam Mohammed case, where eventually the courts did a fantastic job there. The judges did a fantastic job. And they took evidence from people who are known, I think, as Agent A and Agent B. Yeah? And indeed, one of them, I've forgotten which one, I don't want to slander Agent A or Agent B, even by proxy. But one of them was found eventually to have misled the court, and I think he ended up in front of the Metropolitan Police for a while. So I think it's perfectly possible to maintain proper levels of secrecy whilst at the same time holding the agencies to account, so long as we don't swallow some of the lines we get about what needs to be secret and what doesn't have to be secret. And that's why the secret courts issue is important. Yeah.
But just to finish that, the two individuals that Ian mentions in his opening story, I mean, will they ever be held to account?
Were they?
Matt and Richard, the young MI5 officers who were questioning Slowden. I think entirely unlikely that they will, or indeed the people who were questioning others in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and involved in other matters in other places. No, I can't see that happening.
Can I intercede again? Because I actually don't think they are, at the end of the day, the primary guilty parties. The people who wrote the guidelines for them are the guilty parties in this exercise. Now, understand, we're talking about 2002?
2004 in the case of Slowden.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So 2002, 2004, that sort of period. Immediately after 9/11, you're a young MI5 or MI6 officer. You are tasked with protecting the people of this country from another 9/11. That's how you see it at the time. Now, we know since then it hasn't happened, but that's how you see it at the time. And you're given guidelines as to how you do it. And I think the people who've really got to be held to account in all of this are the people who write those guidelines, who actually say, this is how the tactic is done, this is legal, this is proper, and so on, because they're the people who really have to think this through.
What charge would they actually face?
Possibly one of torture, being involved in torture, acquiescing in torture is an offence under the 1988 Criminal Justice Act. So that's one possibility. As David says, they're given very clear instructions. They're told, if you do this and don't do that, you're staying within the law. This is how you remain legal. This is how you remain just on the right side of the law. They're given advice which allows them to get as close as they possibly can to torture without crossing the line and committing a criminal offence. That's what they're told, and that, of course, would be their defence.
Could that be done under civil law, like Pinochet, for example? That nobody's sort of gone in that direction for the lower.
In the States they have, so there's some really interesting civil cases in the States. One, in fact, against an airline company, which is a subsidiary of...
Was that Jefferson?
Jefferson, yeah. Subsidiary of Blackwater. You all heard of Blackwater? And Jefferson is one of the organisations that supplied aircraft for flying people around the world to be tortured in Syria or Egypt or Pakistan. And actually the American Civil Liberties Union took a civil case against Jefferson, which they lost. But one of the successes of that case is the exposure of many thousands of documents about the US's policy on rendition. So it's not an entire failure. And there have been a number of others that have challenged habeas corpus issues on behalf of Guantanamo detainees.
Clive, quickly, and then a question from there.
Yeah. And there are cases now going on over Libya and complicity in rendition. I think it's important to highlight, at least from our point of view, on Libya, and also in Pakistan, the two areas where we as Human Rights Watch have found evidence of British involvement, complicity in torture. We found both cases accidentally. We were doing a report on torture by the Pakistani ISI, and then the people we spoke to, the victims, said, oh, and by the way, you knew the British were involved. No, one side. Different with Libya. My colleague happened to be in Tripoli just after it fell and was taken to the former office of Musa Kusa, the head of intelligence agency, and then came across some documents which happened to be in plain English because they were from the first years of the British involvement with Libya, and there had been facts there. And so this may well be the tip of the iceberg. We don't know what else is there.
Question over there.
Oh yes, it's something that has been touched on, but I'm interested in how the panel feel about the idea of degrees of torture, because I'm coming from the perspective of someone who's anti-torture, but I think this idea that some torture is justified because it's not that severe is interesting, and I'm just interested in kind of...
This is a little bit what we were saying before, wasn't it? So, Clive, there's clear legislation on it, but should some of it be...
That's why there cannot be some good torture, some lesser torture, and some bad torture. It's torture. That's why torture is unique. Not this international law in human rights, and even at moral standard, that it's defined as severe harm, deliberately inflicted. So lesser forms will not be torture.
Can that be, is this a government thing, or is there the international agreement? Could one government come out and change the rules on it, Ruth?
Well, it's a convention, isn't
it? The US attempted to, and this is what's quite interesting about Donald Rumsfeld in particular, who famously made the argument that, I mean, he chooses not to work at a desk, he stands up to do his work. So he made the argument that he stands for 8 hours a day, so surely a stress position of someone being forced to stand can't possibly be torture. And why this is so dangerous is because it strips the torture scenario of its context. And its context is incredibly important. The torture victim is not just standing. He's standing in an excruciating position where every time he drops a limb because he's exhausted for the hours he's been standing there, he'll be beaten to lift that limb again. He will also be subjected to all kinds of other deprivation. So it's very difficult to say, is there a kind of lesser torture? Because torture never involves just one phenomenon. It's multiple phenomena all at once in conditions that we would not normally want anyone to be found in.
Yeah,
particularly the denial of the access.
I think
to
there's also a
lawyers
practical issue here, and that is it's a bit like the ticking bomb scenario. It's irrelevant because it never happens. In the case of most torturers, they don't stop at a certain level. They don't say, right, this is legal, we're going to stop there and don't go any further. I mean, the other side of the coin, I just apply a practical test. I was very heavily involved in the Binyan Mohammed case. Would I have put the effort in if he'd just suffered a little bit of sleep deprivation and hooded a few times? Probably not. But he was hanged by his wrists, he was beaten, had scalpels taken to him, and God knows what else. The torturers don't hesitate to go beyond any line that you and I will talk about. So in practice, it's an interesting
there's
philosophical...
a horror element for us in this.
It's a horror element, but
yeah.
it's an interesting philosophical discussion for us, but in practice, they pretty much all go all the way.
Can I just add to this? Because one of the things that the CIA tried to do was stipulate exactly what could be done when they waterboarded. And if you're not familiar with it, there's a very interesting internal investigation by the CIA, which was carried out in 2004, but not declassified until 2009. And this was not Human Rights Watch writing this. This was the CIA Inspector General. And he looked at the use of waterboarding by the CIA against a number of individuals whose names are now quite famous, Abu Zubaydah in particular. And so one of the things that the Attorney General in the US and the Office of Legal Counsel for the CIA had agreed was how much waterboarding was okay. And where it became not okay anymore to waterboard. And in every single case, the CIA agents went way further than what had been legalised within the CIA. They also used a whole range of techniques that hadn't been permitted. So mock executions, threatening with power drills, all kinds of other tactics around the edges. So I think we need to be very careful when we start saying, oh, well, there might be some torture that's, okay, or there's lesser degrees. Because then they're never, as David said, they're never used and then they stop because that bit might be illegal. It always goes much further.
And one test is, does it induce terror? I mean, the feeling about waterboarding was, well, there's no marks on them afterwards. And it used to be called other things, the water procedure in earlier days. That bit was torture. To answer your question, but does it induce terror? Yes, it bloody well does induce terror. So it's torture,
Question over there. The microphone is.
Hello. Just making sure it's on. My name is Vas. I work as a consultant.
Not in torture, I hope.
Well, I could be a business consultant. So essentially, my question is: there's a current case going on with Abu Huraira. We're trying to deport him off to Jordan, I believe, where he's pushing back, saying that he's going to be succumb to torture if he gets sent to Jordan. The media are all for it, sending him to Jordan, and so are most of the British public. I just wanted to understand your thoughts on that.
David, why don't you start?
Which one is it?
It's Abu Qatada.
Abu Qatada.
Yeah,
Well,
Abu
look,
Qatada,
funnily enough, I'm not particularly an advocate of keeping him here, but the simple truth is, and the reason he's not being deported is not because it's expected that he'll be tortured, it's because that there are concerns over whether the basis upon which he might be convicted is evidence that might be gained under torture. That's not quite the same. I still don't much approve of that, but I think it is possible for the British government to obtain undertakings from Jordan that there will be a trial without depending on such information. If they can do that, I'm entirely happy he's deported. If I thought for a second he would actually be tortured, I'd give the opposite answer.
Can we have another question from here? And then, yep.
Hello, my name is Beata. I'm film and media student at Birkbeck, and I'm part of London Guantanamo campaign. I've been researching on Guantanamo particularly, but sort of it widened up during the last few years on also other secret prisons for nearly a decade now. I'm very strongly opposed torture, and I think any civilized society should oppose it, because torture always leads backwards, never doesn't lead to the progress. It takes us to the Middle Ages and to times from Spanish Inquisition. I also opposed any kind of secrecy, because in my opinion secrecy always smells with crime. So I would like to have the accountability trials made in an open to the public, open to journalist courts. And my question is, because I every day I think about it, every night I research on it, and I really hope that any kind of accountability actually is achievable within my lifetime. And because the extent of the acceptance and sort of blackout in mainstream media, even the fact that this discussion is here today, not in the mainstream media, that sort of just confirms that there is a total blackout in mainstream media on that matter. My question is whether the accountability process shouldn't start with the judges, for instance, because I've got a feeling that there is a bit of, there is a corruption in legal system, and there's been many cases when human rights have not been upheld, and where do we start that accountability? Because if there will be a lack of accountability, that only opens a gate to more crimes, and it sort of stops even public opinion, and it spreads ignorance, and it's really, really dangerous for us as mankind to not hold certain people accountable for. And where do we start, and whether it's achievable in, for instance, someone's like me, lifespan. Yeah.
Clive, are we dealing with a corrupt legal system that's stopping these cases getting out?
To actually bring some mood of a little bit of positiveness finally to the evening, I think it is achievable in our time. It's achievable now, if we could. Yes, there has been many cases where all parts of let's say the British establishment, and all of us represented here, NGOs, Parliament, media, even the Academy, have been part of that, is not believing what would go on. But there have been honourable exceptions also who are on this panel. And in the judicial system, one of the best judges in taking on the issue and not believing the state and upholding the rights of torture victims was Tom Bingham in the last few years, Lord Bingham, who became the most senior judge in the country. And his cases, he sadly died a few years ago, but his cases have struck down many of the worst practices. But the key now for me is getting proper prosecutions and investigations at the most senior level. And for that, I can see two things which are needed in the shake-up of the British system. One is to get politics out of the justice system, and particularly the Attorney General, who remains this unreformed system. I happen to think the current Attorney General is a good
He's not bad.
Man, yeah. Dominic Grieve, who's one of the other defenders of human rights. But still, he shouldn't be deciding who gets prosecuted, especially if they're politicians of whatever party. The other is getting this concept of command responsibility into the system. And when I've been speaking to military prosecutors who haven't prosecuted on Iraq, who haven't prosecuted the highest level, they're not even aware of it. And I thought they were having me on to start with, and they aren't. And the same system that Britain goes and applies in other countries of you must be held accountable at the highest level for war crimes and crimes against humanity just needs to be applied here as well.
Yeah.
Well, I think that history shows that there isn't accountability for these matters, and I'm rather pessimistic about the possibility there will be. Maybe in the case of Libya, it's very difficult to see how there can't be successful prosecutions of the Libyan renditions, because the documentary evidence of British involvement is so clear. It's absolutely clear. It's there in black and white. On the other hand, this being Britain, one sort of assumes that former senior intelligence officers and former foreign ministers are not going to end up in the dock. That there will be some sort of, maybe there'll be a Saunders type defence of somebody will suddenly have a stroke, something of this nature. It's, don't hold your breath, really, if you think that people. If you want to.
Don't hold your breath.
No, don't, because look how long the Gibson inquiry is taking.
Well, it's dead.
Not the Gibson inquiry, sorry, the Iraq War inquiry. The Iraq War is taking, and it's very clear that very little will be revealed through that process.
I think maybe after another generation there'll be some sort of acknowledgement of what the UK did following 9/11, following 7/7. There will be acknowledgement, in another generation, but it won't take just another general election. It will take another generation before this happens, in the same way that it took us almost 40 years to acknowledge what we did in Londonderry or Derry on Bloody Sunday. Even the Hillsborough. Even the Hillsborough inquiry showed that it takes 20-odd years before there can be acknowledgement of incompetence leading to death.
Well, I fear this one might be a bit quicker. I mean, one of the problems.
Well, when you say this one, what do you mean exactly?
This round, the sort of post 9/11.
Post 9/11 round. Yeah.
Post 9/11 round. Our latest sin. Yeah. I mean, when the Binyam Mohammed case got to the sort of crux, it hadn't been picked up by the press at all, and I got sucked into it. What was said to me by the senior political journalist on the BBC, when I was briefing him on this the day before we broke the story, he said, all my security correspondents say this is these are the paranoid fantasies of left-wing journalists and liberal lawyers, unquote. And that is exactly what he said. So you had that on the one hand, and on the other hand you had the fact that most of us are unwilling to believe that people will do this to their fellow men. You know, the idea that we'd send somebody off to Morocco to be hung up and have his genitals cut by scalpels was just unbelievable. I found it difficult to believe, and I had to sort of persuade myself before we started down the route. But we've got through that, and you know, it was well-known liberal newspapers like the Daily Mail who put it on the front page, as well as obviously the Guardian and others. So, and truthfully, our courts have been heroes in this. They've not been villains; they have been heroes in terms of it was. We couldn't have done it without the judges on Binyam Mohammed. So there is a possibility. Now, the truth is, we are facing a rearguard action. That rearguard action is going on right now, and it's called, well, we call it the Secret Courts Bill. It's called the Criminal Justice Bill, actually, but we call it because what they're trying to do is to allow ministers to determine what will be heard in court. It's a bloody disgraceful proposal. It's my own government, but it's a bloody disgraceful proposal that a minister who is party to the case and is taking advice from the agency that's being challenged will be able to say, I'm sorry, you the public, you the journalist, indeed you the plaintiff or you the defendant cannot know what the evidence is, and that's the big thing we're going to defeat now. If we defeat that, we'll do it this generation.
But I think there's something else that must be defeated as well, and I've been teaching in universities, getting students to think about torture for 10 years. 10 years ago, very few of my students would accept the possibility that you would even consider torturing someone. Now the majority think it's okay.
That's because they're being taught by you.
Not doing a very good job then. Well, hopefully not. But what they are subjected to is a diet of total nonsense on things like 24, James Bond, all of our hero, and yes, I did go and see Skyfall. But these are really strong cultural imperatives that drive an agenda, and that's quite dangerous, I think.
We're going to have one here and then one here after. Yes?
Yeah, so I'm Sam, I'm a journalism student from City University. So a few of you have mentioned the Mau Mau case and sort of what's happened there, and one of the lines that very much drew into the sand is that the victims had to be alive in order to sue the British government. But if you take something like the case of the Batang Kali massacre in Malaya, the last survivor died 2 years ago, and the people who are trying to bring the case against the British government are people who were 8 or 9 when their parents were killed. Do you think that was a fair line to be drawn in the sand? Does torture only affect those who were themselves affected, or does it still affect the people, the family members who had loved ones taken away or changed irrevocably because of their experiences? And just one other second quick question for Mr. Davies. At the very beginning, you said how in some situations you think torture would be moderately acceptable, and you've already talked about...
No, I never said that at all.
Oh,
I said it works.
You've worked. Okay,
there are circumstances under which, this is Ian's point really, that there are circumstances under which it has been shown to work. There are plenty of ones where it's shown to have the opposite effect too.
Okay,
but anyway, even then, it's not justified.
Okay, but so you've since qualified saying there are other more successful or effective techniques short of torture, which you mentioned a few questions ago. At what level, at what point of suspicion or offence or crime, do you think that level of intimidation or manipulation becomes acceptable to use?
Shall I do that straight away?
Yes, if you can do that quickly, because
very
I'd like to
quickly.
take this
It's
one
not
before
intimidation. I mean, as I say, I recommend you go and read some of the write-ups of the FBI's treatment of terrorist suspects, because they didn't use intimidation. There was a certain amount of manipulation, certainly, to get people to tell the truth when they try not to tell the truth, and a certain amount of control of their lives, a certain amount of pressure in that sense. But it was absolutely the civilized way to carry out an interrogation, no harsher than you would get from the Metropolitan Police if you were stopped, or if you were found in the gutter one day, shall we say.
Can we take this question here?
Hi, my name is Sylvia. I'm a trainee solicitor. I just have a very brief question. You mentioned that a way of breaking the cycles of torture is to seek accountability. But how do we do this when we have the Justice and Security Bill now? And then, you know, even in 2010, we had the amendment to the Universal Jurisdiction Law. So it seems that every time there's an attempt to seek an accountability, there's just a change in the legislation.
Okay, let's deal with the age line that was dealt with here. Why don't you?
I mean, how long? You mean, going back to your question, is I think the longer you go back, the different the tools you use. And I'm a lawyer, but the courts only have a certain term. We can't swamp the courts with every single historic case. To bring a case to court, you need victims usually. And some issues may be historic. And yes, and families do get affected in different ways, maybe not as much. So maybe families can be victims. But we know there'll be a point in the past where certain terrible things happened, but now it must be left to the historians, the journalists and others. It still needs to be done. We need to know this. We know it's a historic pattern, and we probably need to go even further back than 1940 and have a proper history. So anyone who is a journalism student, but a historian or with time on your hands, there's a whole amount of work out there to be done. There's, the Mau Mau case produced thousands of papers which were suddenly discovered, undocumented in the Public Records Office, which had been taken back quickly from Nairobi at the time, let alone other countries in the empire. So there's a lot to work on in terms of finding it out. And the court is one way, but it's only one possible way.
I mean, there was an interesting bit in the there on the Mau Mau thing, where originally the British government said it wasn't their responsibility because the Kenyan government carried it out, although it was the Kenyan colonial government.
Yeah, one of these Mau Mau veterans came forward and sought permission at first to bring proceedings against the British government. The British government's first line was, you're suing the wrong people, you should be suing your own government in Kenya because they inherited our legal responsibilities on independence. That hurdle was pushed to one side by the courts, but they still faced a second hurdle, which is that the British government then said, yes, okay, so everything you've said is true. Everything you've alleged, we acknowledge the truth of what you said. But you're too late. You should have done it within 6 years, and you're coming on, 50, 60 years on, and bringing these proceedings. And they lost that, but within hours of losing it, the Foreign Office announced that they were going to appeal. They say it's because it's an important legal principle that such claims should be brought within 3 to 6 years so there can be a proper trial. But of course, what they also know is if they open the floodgates to the Mau Mau veterans, it won't just be these 3 or the thousands of people in Kenya. There will be lots of people in Cyprus. There are people in Cyprus who are watching proceedings very closely and have met with the Mau Mau litigants' lawyers because they are thinking of bringing their own case.
It becomes a class action.
Against the
multiple
class action, international class action. Just, I want to now tackle this one, which was the breaking the cycle you were talking about there, which I think we touched on before. Is what is the legislation? What are the conventions that need to be changed? Ruth? Okay.
I don't think the conventions need to be changed. I think the conventions are crystal clear. I think Britain's incorporation of the European Human Rights Act into its law is appropriate. I think the US has adopted the Convention Against Torture, plus we have the Geneva Conventions for wartime, and I think they are wholly adequate for dealing with these scenarios, but it requires political will. I think I want to tackle your question differently because I can't really speak for the law. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a human rights activist. I can count on the fingers of 2 hands the numbers of really, really good academic works that have been written on British and or American complicity in torture. And Ian's book is now one of them, and he's not in academia. So this is my opportunity to point the finger at my colleagues. Very few people do this work in academia. Why? Because it's difficult. It's very difficult work to do. It's difficult to get funding for it. And now I'm going to point the finger at the government and say the government is cutting funding for higher education, particularly for research grants. But also you...
Particularly on torture.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I happen to have British government funding to do my research on rendition. I was clever because in the application I said it was all about the US. And now I'm doing the stuff on the UK anyway. But I think academics need to be much more strategic about the work they do. I think they need to build alliances with journalists and with human rights organisations to further this accountability issue. And they can do that by teaching students. They can do that by supervising PhDs. They can do that by saying to their PhD students, don't write your PhD to sit in a library for the next 50 years to be read by 3 people. Make sure you have strategies for disseminating your work more broadly beyond the academy. Because otherwise this brilliant research that's been doing by these 20 people in the world that do this are not feeding into these processes. So I guess that would be
David, if this book lands on the Prime Minister's desk and he actually gets round to reading it, he's not going to...
Two improbabilities
Yeah,
for the start.
two completely speculative things. But, or your desk and your Foreign Secretary or whatever it is. You're not going to change anything, are you? Not on Ian's evidence.
Oh, they should. I mean, they should. Whether they will is another matter. But I mean, one of the problems we have is that we, as you said, we grew up in a diet of 24 spooks and all of this nonsense, most of which got absolutely nothing to do with reality. And I'm afraid politicians are the same. And my generation, well, not my generation, the current, as it were, ruling elite, use my word carefully, are pretty young. Most of them have never served in the armed forces. You know, I mean, when Margaret Thatcher made the decision to take back the Falklands, the people around her were Pym, Carrington, Whitelaw. There were people who had all, I mean, in fact, all of those 3 had led tank battalions in the Falaise Gap. They'd seen young men of 18 blown to bits, burned to death and so on, and they'd seen intelligence failures, which led to people dying. As a result, they didn't take the head of MI6 and MI5 and so on quite as seriously, perhaps, as the modern generation do, you know. Part of the problem we have is that we tend to believe our spooks too easily and tend to do what they want too easily, including changing the law. We should be just much tougher with them. And I hope that if they read that, that's what it would do, induce.
A question here.
Yes, Tessa Mays. I'm a journalist and filmmaker making a film about democracy. And I'm quite surprised, actually, that the word democracy hasn't really been that much mentioned. Instead, a lot has been talked about the courts being the solution, changing the law or not changing the law and so forth. But surely the ultimate solution is democracy, democratic pressure by the people and their representatives to make sure that when things go wrong, we change them immediately. And it's the spirit of that that's often missing, because when, for example, you mentioned previously, Ian, that you know, perhaps we should look at the people who wrote the guidelines on torture. What about the people who directed them? Because they're not often in MI6, they're in the Foreign Office, and they're elected, and they use powers where they can do things without accountability to Parliament, which is at least the representation of all of us in a democracy. So surely it's a sort of democratic deficit and a sort of cynicism that maybe democracy can do anything these days that is the wider problem.
Okay, nobody's chaining themselves to the railings. So there's one. Let's get one question in here whilst we're.
Hello, my name is Brian Condon, and I'm a member of the Frontline Club. My question follows on from the previous questioner's point, which is, what should we do about it? And I keep hoping that the panel's going to get closer to that, and you almost do. And then you snap back into legal structures and academia and what politics is. And so, I don't know, what do we do about this?
Well, is there one more question to take? And then we could wrap up on that very good point there about democracy, because that's... Is there any more questions? Yes?
I wonder what your opinion is on how safe politicians feel at the moment. I mean, bearing in mind that there's an attempt to change the law, do you think that politicians are feeling, in the Foreign Office, Foreign Commonwealth Office, they're feeling sort of pretty smug and safe that they're not going to be held accountable for the evidence which clearly is coming out about what's happening over their period of office, and indeed the previous government?
Ian, you wrote the book.
Right.
You gave us this very depressing conclusion. Can you actually give us a solution to it?
I accept blame. I will preface what I say by pointing out that, as I'm a reporter, it's my job to unearth facts, secrets, make sense of them, put them into the public domain, and then let others, such as parliamentarians and NGOs, worry about the consequences. Having said that, however, I would agree entirely that there is a democratic deficit. There's very little democratic oversight of the agencies, because you have these agencies which are agencies of the executive, which are overseen ostensibly by a committee of the executive, the Intelligence and Security Committee. So there's no real parliamentary oversight. The parliamentarians involved, but it's not a parliamentary committee. That is a problem. In terms of what can be done about it, well, again, there is a democratic deficit. I think that there's very few members of the electorate who are concerned about this. Our political leaders know that there's no votes really in preventing terrorism suspects from being tortured, and probably quite a few votes in giving a nod and a wink to these sort of practices. About 3 years ago, when I discovered that there was this secret torture policy, I wrote to Tony Blair and said, right, Mr. Blair, there's this policy which is in place. I can prove that it has led to people being tortured, and I can also prove that you were aware of this policy. I've got the documentary evidence that shows that. Now, is it safe for me to assume that you authorised it? Can you tell us, did you authorise it? What role did you play in its development? And he had somebody else write back on his behalf and say, well, it's simply untrue to say, it's untrue to say that Tony Blair has ever authorised an act of torture. And I said, well, that's not the allegation I made. The question I asked was, what role did you play in authorising this policy that's resulted in people being tortured, and what do you know about the consequences of this policy? So he then had somebody else write back and say, I don't understand your question. So I said, well, look, this is getting simply ridiculous. You do understand the question. Here's all the supporting evidence. There's a policy. You're aware of it. It resulted in people being tortured. What role did you play in authorising it, and what do you know of its consequences? And he came back and said, it's simply untrue to say that Tony Blair authorised an act of torture. So I thought, that's quite revealing, isn't it? But I couldn't take it much further than that. He clearly didn't want to answer the questions being asked of him, and wanted to deny allegations that were being made to him. But in terms of the future, well, David's already talked about this rather Orwellian piece of legislation, the Justice and Security Bill, which as far as I can see is an attempt by this government to codify the cover-up, both to ensure that we don't know about the misdeeds of the previous government, and also to make sure that in the future that litigation for whatever the British government might want to do in the future doesn't reveal the truth about what's been happening. And
so that's going to make it worse.
Oh, in terms of secrecy, it's getting much worse.
Can you see any magic wand being?
No, but
more
you'll be
depressing.
unsurprised that as an academic I'm going to say the answer to many of these issues is education. And I think our democratic deficit can be addressed by proper and rigorous education starting at the primary level, by the importance of engaging in politics. How you do that, I don't know, I don't have all the answers, but I think substantive funding for education right up to the highest levels is key to this. And then in practical steps, I suppose, there are many organisations who are doing tireless work who are underfunded. So Reprieve was mentioned, there's Human Rights Watch, there's Redress, another legal action charity. There are dozens of organisations who you can get involved with, you can support. There's that old-fashioned thing that very few of us do anymore, which is write a handwritten letter to our MP. And I bet you any money your MP will notice if it's handwritten and might just read it.
Yeah, not in green ink, though.
But I think there are all sorts of ways that education is a big part of this, because are we educating our children that they need to think about their role in civil society, in engaging in politics, in what the processes are of addressing your MP, what your MP is there to do. And I think these are some of the basic but fundamental things we have to do if we want to sustain our democracy and sustain accountability of our state.
It seems that, interesting question from here, but coming from here, it's sort of that against schools, transport, health, the badgers, and all the other issues we've got, torture is not one that people are going to march on the streets for.
Until it's them or their loved ones.
Well, until it's, but it's never going to be that many, is it?
Until it's them. one of the triggers for the Egyptian revolution was the torturing to death of a man called Khaled Said, and this was the Facebook page, We Are All Khaled Said, because torture becomes so ingrained there and so part of the system.
Within that society.
But here the torture mostly has been done outside and to foreigners, which makes it more difficult, which is why it may remain a limited issue. But it is important, these are much bigger issues now. The democratic society is not just about public opinion, it's about parliamentarians, it's about the media, it's about NGOs. And again, actually, what I still recommend reading the short history that Ian has set out shows how those as a whole have failed with honourable exceptions over the years. I mean, MPs Barbacaso and media raised the issue of the Mau Mau, nobody listened. So what can you do today as individuals, as citizens? The first thing, as has been said, is fight this bill. It is the most dangerous bill introduced by this government, the secret courts bill, because that's not just taking away the rights of torture victims. It's taking away, it's the attack on one of the basic principles of justice, of open verdicts openly arrived at, and that is not just going to court and winning your case, it's having your case heard. So, and it's cuddly Ken Clark who's still presenting it. So it's putting pressure on all the parties on this, because no party's been very good on it, and because they don't think it's an issue of public opinion. But another issue about breaking that cycle is going outside. I think this is why I'm more positive, things are more international. Ultimately, there's an international criminal court at the end, which has a mandate over war crimes and crimes against humanity. Not expected to deal with the United Kingdom, may be difficult, but if it's not dealt with here, it has to be dealt with there.
David, I'd just like to ask you, as well as wrapping up for us, as to how you would bring us a solution if you were in power. Would you be able to campaign for the Tory party leadership on a campaign of eradicating torture and holding to account those that had carried it out?
Not the issue I'd pick if I wanted to win. Look, let me just say a few things. Number one, democracy won't save you on this. If you ask the American public, not the British public, I don't know what the numbers are, do you approve of the use of torture against terrorists? 74% say yes. That's the sort of number you're looking at. 74% say yes, right? When the Binyam Mohammed case came up, and bear in mind I only came into it by accident, only because some journalist ran me up and said, we're trying to make this work, can you help? A number of my colleagues said, you're not seriously against torture, are you? So that's what you're up against. It's not democracy that's going to save us on this, it's a sense of honour. Because this is about our national honour. And I cite as my best example of this the man who wrote the best letter to The Guardian on this subject was a man called Charles Guthrie, who was the chief of the defence staff. He was the most senior soldier in the country at one point. He was an ex-SAS squadron commander and a very, very, very tough soldier, somebody I would not want to be on the opposite end of a rifle to. And he took it, and indeed in Ian's book, you see time and again, actually, the SAS regiment come to the fore saying, stop this is a bad thing. Good soldiers, people who are patriots, people who believe in what we are and what we stand for, or else what we think we stand for, are antagonistic to torture in the most ferocious way. So this is not an issue which is going to be solved by solving a democratic deficit. It's going to be solved by honourable people saying, up with this, we will not put.
I was going to wrap, but he's been so persistent. Very quickly, please. You've come a long way there.
And this is what I've heard from the panel tonight is more or less what we've been hearing in Liverpool for 23 years. Is the independent panel model a possible way of moving forward on issues where the total establishment is against public opinion?
Ruth and Clyde, let's quickly, very quickly.
There was to be an independent inquiry, and it was quashed because there was no confidence that it would do a good enough job from the human rights community. So the basic details, in very brief, are that the government refused to accept that if the panel uncovered evidence that proved individuals had been tortured at the hand of the secret services, they would hand over that evidence. They said no, and eventually, after a lot of wrangling, the human rights organisations walked away because they felt that this was not honourable, in fact immoral, and totally unacceptable. So at the moment, unless there is a fully independent inquiry where there is no attempt by government to cover things up, then I don't think it can work.
Clive, quickly.
It's part of the solution, a comprehensive public inquiry, but it's not. It can not and should never be seen as the end point. The history of Britain and the British establishment is full of public inquiries which were set up to kick something into the long grass and to cover things up. And we fought, and David and others fought, to have this public inquiry, the Gibson inquiry. We were one of the last organisations to pull out of it, just because in any event you thought you might get something out of it, no matter how lack of independence, even reviewing something would have been good. But in the end, it turned out to be the worst possible type, and it was clear that everything will be held and decided by the government and not to be independent. So at least a properly independent inquiry, but much more is needed, particularly prosecutions.
You want to say five seconds?
Yeah, well, I just want to remind you of a poem, really.
Okay.
I was thinking about the democratic issue and the fact that we tend to put up with this when it's people we don't identify with, minority groups or foreigners or whatever. And the best description of this was a Pastor Niemöller poem. Don't know if you know it. You know, he's the man who started out. The poem starts something like this: "First they came for the Jews, and I was not a Jew, so I said nothing." You know, and it ends with "Then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak for me." And the point we have to get across, and this is the point of honour again, is that if there's an injustice or torture applied to anybody, it afflicts all of us. If we recognise that, we'll win the fight.
Thank you. I'd just like to say that this is on sale at a cut price here, and the more copies that are bought will fund Ian's next book.
Yeah.
And we'll be able to move the issue on even more. And a round of applause, please, for the panel.